I'd like to begin by acknowledging country and paying my respects to the traditional owners here in Melbourne. It's always, coming from Sydney myself and the community there, a particularly difficult task to keep the responsibility for country, a generous task in urban areas, and I pay my respects to them for that cultural responsibility. It's true, if I was to rant about how I feel we face too many barriers and Indigenous disadvantage today, we'd be here for a lot longer than 20 minutes. So, quite outside of my character as a lawyer and a very opinionated woman, to keep things short, I thought I'd try and tackle this problem today by coming at it by looking at what I think are maybe three pieces of rhetoric that permeate the discussions around Indigenous policy that I think are particularly unhelpful in terms of helping us get right down to solving Indigenous disadvantage. Some of these I've looked at in depth when I've been asked to look at things like why the left seem to have abandoned the ideological space of being the best advocates for Indigenous issues. And you'll see why when you see the three areas that I've picked up. I think one of the most harmful pieces of rhetoric that's permeated the discussion around Indigenous rights really started to come in around the Howard era, when Howard abandoned a rights framework and the policy that was called self-determination, though it's a completely different discussion as to whether it was self-determination in practice, and said that instead of looking at rights issues, we were going to take a practical reconciliation approach. And the rhetoric then became, especially with the abolition of ATSIC, that self-determination had failed. And it was sort of an assumption that seems to have been quite accepted, and you hear people on the left and the right simply kind of tick a box and say, yes, it was a failed experiment and self-determination has failed. One of the most interesting research projects we're doing at Jumbana at the moment is looking at communities in New South Wales where there is a high crime rate and comparing them to communities that aren't very far away from them that have low crime rates. So, for example, we've looked at Wilcannia and Menindee, we've looked at Burke and Lightning Ridge, we've looked at Gunnedah and Kempsey. And one of the things that continues to come through in relation to one of the factors that explains why some communities are able to have low crime rates is a sense within the community that when there's a problem, there's an ability to be able to control it. So to give you an example, if you speak to the women of Menindee, and I say the women of Menindee because you won't be perhaps surprised to hear that in some of the communities where there are low crime rates, it's because the Aboriginal women are particularly strong and have an element of moral authority which seems to sort of keep a social cohesiveness going in the community. And the communities that have the high crime rates don't have that. In fact, that social fabric and the moral authority of people seems to have completely dissipated. And this is true even if they're, maybe just an hour away from each other, and when you're talking about spaces in New South Wales, that's not all that far. You talk to the women of Menindee, and if there's a problem there, they usually have an idea of how to fix it, and they're very confident about their ability to do that. So, for example, if there's a problem with kids sniffing the spray cans with the paint in it, they'll decide that the best way to tackle it might be to have an intervention at the school, see which kids have the spray cans and deal with them accordingly. Or if kids aren't going to school, they'll decide what they're going to do is someone's going to go down to the riverbank, find the kids and take them to school. These are very simple solutions, but when you compare that to the way people in Wilcannia will respond when you ask them about how they deal with social problems. They'll say things like, well, we tried that, but the council never listened to us, or governments come and go here, government services come and go here and no one pays any attention, or we've never bothered trying to get a job at that place because they've never employed a black person. And what you start to see really strongly is that the people in Menindee have a sense that if there's a problem, they actually have the capacity and the ability and the skills to be able to fix it. And there's none of that in Wilcannia, where there's almost a sort of debilitation and a sense of listlessness that people don't have the tools in their own hands in terms of being able to fix these things. Now, there are lots of reasons why a community gets to those two particular points, but the issue that I wanted to highlight in terms of this concept of self-determination is that I think that what the women do in Menindee is actually a form of self-determination. To me, It's that ability for people to be able to, where they see a problem that's affecting their own community, feel that they have the capacity and that they do have the capacity to be able to make those changes. There's a whole range of capacity building that has to go into allowing people to have that space to feel that way. But it's not surprising that this idea of having Indigenous people centrally involved in deciding what the priorities are within their community, with having them centrally involved with the policy making that goes on that affects their community, and centrally involved in at least designing the programs, if not actually having a key role in implementing the programs that go into their community. There are plenty of common sense reasons you can already think of, I'm sure, as to why the evidence would show that relate to things like the fact that if you've got Indigenous people running the service, it's more culturally appropriate, they've got their informal networks through the community, that means they're linked in through those networks to other services, there's a credibility within the community, etc, etc. The research backs up why that is a much more effective way to deal with socioeconomic problems. So at the heart of it, if we see self-determination as being a part of this ability for people to be involved with these decisions and to control their own lives, the rhetoric that self-determination has failed is really unhelpful. And it's become quite dangerous because there is an underlying assumption that Indigenous people aren't actually capable of controlling their own destiny, that their services aren't as well equipped to deal with social issues, and that just runs against what all of the evidence shows actually works. The second piece of rhetoric that I wanted to highlight that's not unrelated to that, because it came into the political conversation around Indigenous policy at about the same time as this rhetoric that self-determination has failed. And that's the rhetoric that the rights framework is also a failure, or is merely a luxury of the elite, that it doesn't have any relationship to the real world. There's a historical argument very strongly, I think, why that's wrong. You only have to look at what happened in the 1970s in Australia with the political activism that very much focused on rights, that facilitated the modern land rights movement and was really the push to some quite substantial societal changes that opened up things like educational opportunities for Indigenous people. I think you can see the power of the rights movement around then, and of course that civil rights movement within the Indigenous community paralleled a lot of other civil rights movements which were being engaged with at the time, particularly the women's movement, of course, which was also focused on these issues of rights. But putting that to one side, although I think that's in and of itself a strong argument as to why the dismissal of human rights and rights frameworks are unhelpful, is that we actually can see very clear ways in which human rights can provide very real mechanisms for Indigenous people to try and change their situation and the policies that affect them. And the example I'm going to give you that I think makes this argument is actually an instance where those rights weren't in place. And I want to draw your attention to an instance within the Northern Territory intervention. And I choose that because that was a particularly harsh policy where the rhetoric of these things need to be done and we can't worry about human rights, or the rhetoric of it's about protecting women and children, and anything that's done to question that is kind of protecting the rights of pedophiles. That very unhelpful rhetoric surrounded the Northern Territory intervention. And within that very politicised, polarising debate, that very emotional debate, the importance of human rights was put to one side. As many of you would know, when the Northern Territory intervention was put in place, it was with a claim that one of the things that it would do was to link school attendance with welfare payments, which gave the impression that the policy would be that if you didn't send your kids to school, you would be punished by having your welfare payments quarantined. And I'm sure for people who love a tough love approach to policy, that's very attractive. The reality of it was that rather than the policy going into Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory in that way, the Territory intervention, as you may be aware, simply identified 73 Indigenous communities, and everyone who lived in those 73 Indigenous communities, if they were on a welfare payment of any kind, whether it was a veterans payment, aged care, disability, those welfare payments were quarantined. So whether your children went to school or not, whether you had children or not. So you had situations where people had been in control of their money the whole of their lives without any issue, and suddenly they found themselves subjected to this very restrictive policy where 50% of your income was quarantined for spending in very specific areas in very specific ways. In order to implement this policy, there was a requirement to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act because it was racially discriminatory. It's a pretty easy test. But in addition to that, the Northern Territory intervention also suspended rights to appeal to the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in the Northern Territory, and it suspended the rights to appeal to the Social Security Appeals Tribunal. So if you found yourself living in one of these 73 prescribed communities and you found yourself with your income quarantined, there wasn't a single available place within Australia, a tribunal that you would normally be able to use to make a complaint about your treatment. It was an extraordinary infringement of this simple right to due process before the law, and completely unthinkable that we would so unquestioningly allow that to happen to other people in Australia. And I think that it's an important example, first of all, because it shows what rhetoric like "we just care about women and children and human rights aren't important" can actually mask. But I think what you can also appreciate is there was this policy that was designed in a 48-hour period was rushed into these communities. And even the current minister who defends the policies very tenaciously concedes that that was rushed and that people were taken by surprise, and that was a very negative thing. But with a rushed policy, you'd at least want to have the chance to be able to review it. And as you'd be aware, these sorts of mechanisms like the Social Security Appeals Tribunal and Anti-Discrimination Commissions are very important forums where we as citizens can go to say, look, this is what's happening to me in relation to how this policy is working, and it's not fair or it's not right or it's causing some hardship. Adverse findings against the way these policies are being implemented against governments and the people who administer those sorts of policies are a very important mechanism that we have to temper and change policies where they're causing undue hardship. So, I think it's worth remembering that not only do I think this is quite a disturbing example of a human rights breach, but I think that you can see how this very simple human right that was in some ways just characterised as though it was just a principle about being free from racial discrimination actually gave people a very real right, which was to go to the Human Rights Commission and say what's happening to me isn't right. And it's a very key way in which governments can be held accountable or at least questioned about the impacts of their policies. And I don't think I need to harbour on about it by pointing out that these were, of course, some of the most disenfranchised and disadvantaged communities that were subject to this policy. The third area of rhetoric that I think is becoming increasingly unhelpful in relation to Indigenous policy and finding some real solutions is the rhetoric that did start to creep in through the Howard era as well, about the fact that Aboriginal people need to take responsibility and there needs to be mutual obligation. And I think it's important to point out that although these three instances I've chosen of rhetoric did become popular during the Howard era, they have still stayed around in the post-Howard era, and I think these are criticisms that go across political lines. And certainly this idea that Indigenous people need to be more responsible about the issues they face is one that is still very much now becoming part of the rhetoric of our current Prime Minister, one of the things that Kevin Rudd did while he was Prime Minister, perhaps in the euphoria of having given the apology, was to make a commitment that on the first sitting day of Parliament, the federal government would deliver a report card on what it had done to close the gap. Now, increasingly this turns out to be an embarrassment for governments because they start the first sitting day by having to do a report card on what they haven't done for Indigenous affairs, so that was a nice little goodbye present from Kevin Rudd to Julia Gillard. So faced with that, it's not surprising that governments express their frustration that their efforts haven't done enough to improve disadvantage. There's not a lot to report on other than how much money they're spending and what new programs they're putting in. But in terms of actual results, experts across the board, particularly in the field of health, are very cynical about these report cards for their lack of detail on what's been achieved. Gillard's speech this year was particularly interesting in terms of this idea of Aboriginal people having to take more responsibility. She said very firmly that until Aboriginal people put down the bottles and send their children to school, these issues aren't going to be resolved. This was a similar thing in relation to the pathway that the Howard government went down when they came in and said they were going to try practical reconciliation 4 years into their government. There'd been no noticeable improvements in the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia in the socio-economic statistics, and then that's when you started to see this introduction of the shared responsibility, mutual obligation idea. What I thought was particularly unhelpful about Gillard's approach in this speech is that this focusing on Aboriginal people as part of the problem is an incredibly unhelpful way to have a dialogue, and it's unhelpful in two ways. As you can imagine, if we're going to have that sort of arrangement which the research shows works about governments working with Indigenous people and having them centrally involved, there is an element of trust that needs to be developed between governments and the communities. And I would argue that since the Northern Territory intervention, that issue of trust between communities has actually gone to an all-time low, and that this sort of rhetoric doesn't help in building that trust. It's obviously aimed at a different sector of the community than the 2% within the Indigenous community. But more fundamentally than that, this is the mistake that gets made here. When we look at things that do work to solve Indigenous disadvantage, and just let's look at this difficult issue around school attendance, there's actually quite a lot of evidence of what does work to get Aboriginal kids to school. For example, things like breakfast and lunch programs, a very simple thing where schools and members of the community put on meals for kids, and it attracts them when they come from dysfunctional families to have a place to eat. Things like having elders in residence, as you can understand, having an Indigenous person from the community on staff in any capacity builds a link between the community and the school. Things like having Aboriginal teachers' aides in the classroom, using curriculum that engages Indigenous kids because it's culturally appropriate. Let me just clarify that too, because that culturally appropriate teaching in the classrooms is often mischaracterised by its critics as though the classroom focuses on teaching culture and not on literacy and numeracy, but these culturally appropriate teaching, appropriate teaching methods that are reflected in things like bilingual language programs actually acknowledge that when kids come into the classrooms, in some remote communities, English might be their second or third language, so it's a way of actually getting them to learn how to spell and read and write in their own language so that they actually know what the letters mean. It's easier for them to learn English. These are all models of getting kids into school that have been shown to work, and all of them are ideas that haven't been thought up by bureaucrats in Canberra and imposed on communities. They're actually ideas that have come from communities, and in this context that we're talking about, communities working with schools, It's not just within this education area that we see the best ways of dealing, most effective ways of dealing with quite entrenched solutions come from the communities. So this approach that Gillard had in her speech, where she pointed out the problems that Indigenous communities can create and in what she saw as a barrier to improving the socio-economic position, actually overlooks the fact that within those communities there are, I would argue, more people who actually decide that they're not going to wait for governments to come and help them. In fact, they've kind of given up on governments coming to help them, and they sit there and they find solutions to these problems on their own. And you can look at that across the board. Example, substance abuse mechanisms for dealing with that have also, the strongest, most effective things were actually things that were decided by communities, getting a community bus to go around and pick up people who were drunk and take them to dry out places, or having safe houses. These are all community design programs, and it seems to me that while governments dismiss both the capacity and the creativity of communities to find these solutions, they're certainly not looking like they're going to pick up some of these very simple ideas. And it's very costly. As I mentioned to you, there are a range of things that we know improve attendance at schools, which I mentioned, the breakfast and lunch programs, etc. There's no evidence anywhere that linking welfare payments to school attendance improves the number of kids going to school. In fact, there's some evidence that it puts additional stress on already dysfunctional families, and certainly in the Northern Territory, attendance rates are slightly less than what they were before the intervention went in. Yet that first round of reform to the welfare payment system that quarantined incomes cost the taxpayer $88 million just in administration costs. That wasn't any money that flowed into the community, and not $1 in that first wave of the intervention was spent on any of those programs that we know works. That probably is in and of itself another example of why we don't see any movement there. So the thing that I think frustrates many of us is that it's not true to say that we don't know what the answers are. In fact, there's plenty of evidence of what actually works, but we continue to see governments ignore that evidence, not only ignore that evidence, but continue to treat Aboriginal people as part of the problem, not as part of the solution. And it becomes, I think, an area where we probably need the hardest discussions around policy, where we see the most rhetoric. I can't think of any movement in terms of income management from either this government or the previous one, but we see so much evidence that it's failing, including things like an increase in anemia rates in children under 5, an increase in malnutrition rates amongst people in the Northern Territory. They're not figures that have come from independently, the malnutrition rates. They're actually government figures, though I noticed in the last 6 months they stopped reporting them because they're continuing to get worse. That's not the kind of honest policy debate that we need to have if we're going to resolve any of these issues.